Hey guys, welcome back to another Vanguard video. Today we're here talking about Blaz Folia. This is the brand new lyrical rideline that we just got revealed today that actually centers around Dragoroid units, but funnily enough, she's a human. So continuous Vanguard circle, the first skill, all of your Dragoroid trigger units get shield +5, and during your turn, the power increase of trigger effects get +5, and of course that will increase for non-Dragoroid triggers during your turn. But for the defensive ability, it's only Dragoroid triggers, and this is right now basically the cards that released alongside Clarissa, which are the usual regular Dragoroid triggers that are heals, fronts, draws, and crits, of course all without additional effect triggers. The additional +5k shield effects. So they'll basically be 20k shields, or for the draws, 10k shields. So once you're on grade 3, and the grade 2 rideline spoiler also has a similar ability, you can get a lot more defensive utility out of your triggers. So this deck plays a lot more defensive compared to Sweet Linkers, where you just wanted to eat more damage and kind of heal it out and have that come back with really strong numbers. The second skill for Folia is the Act on Vanguard circle. Once per turn, you cost Energy Blast 3. You look at the top 7 cards of your deck and choose up to 1 Dragoroid without Sentinel or normal order from among them. Reveal it, put into your hand. You choose one of your opponent's rear guards with the same grade as the revealed card and retire it. And if you do, you shuffle your deck. So retire is pretty unique to Lyrical. There isn't really too much retire right now if you don't look at Alf Knights and Bav right now in the meta. So really cool that we are getting more retire, because we haven't really had a grade, specific retire effect like this since really Gandiva. So I think that's really interesting, and also being able to check top 7 and grab a normal order is really strong. And because it doesn't specify without Regulus piece, you can grab, Caliburn, you could grab Ladder, the usual list, Shrouded Shadow, blah, 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 of all the normal order Regulus pieces. So I think that is a very, very unique skill that they specifically did not write in on purpose, which I'm quite surprised by. Otherwise, you would see the Regulus piece icon in here. For the third skill, it's also very strong. Act on Vanguard circle. When this unit attacks, costs counterblast 1. You choose all of your front row's Dragoroid rear guards and stand them. If your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, you choose all of your backrow Dragoroid rear guards as well and stand them as well. So as you can already tell, you want to play a lot of Dragoroid rear guards. One of the ones that will stand out as the older rear guard that is generic is Strega. Strega is a Dragoroid, and of course, because you are going to be playing normal orders essentially every turn, your rideline finds them, you have your check top 7 for them, it's very easy to get that condition for Strega set up. And Strega also has the ability, when your opponent's grade 3 greater on attack, if it was played this turn, to counterblast, draw 1 and get plus 10k. So a lot of your CV will basically go into this and Strega, and of course Strega in any order turn 2 is going to be easy early game to rush down your opponent and fill up your board with Dragoroid rear guards, which is really important because you want to get the full board restand. And there's also spoilers, grade 1 later, that does rest 3 backrow Dragoroid rear guards to give a red tech skill to your Vanguard to give +5, and then if your opponent's grade 3 greater, +10. So the deck's doing 5 attacks, got to retire every turn. You have easy, power increase your trigger, and that +5k will mean 10k more shield out of your opponent's hand, which does make a pretty big difference, especially when you sack going first. It'll basically make your columns unguardable essentially. And then, you also have that shield +5. So whether you go first or second, you still have utility out of your generic triggers in order to get the extra shield. So currently there's only one type for each trigger for the normal Dragoroid 15k triggers. Unusual, draws are 5k shields. So the lineup will probably be something like crits, fronts, heals, and then maybe you could play draws, because if you play any non-Dragoroid triggers, of course they won't get the buff, but they will get the power increase for during your turn when you drive check them. And then if you flip OT, it's like 100 mil to something, and then a +5k, which is like hilarious. 100 mil 5k, by the way. A lot like that's making too much of a difference, because if you flip OT, that stuff is unguardable anyways. But the point is that it's got really 3 really strong effects. I do think though, after looking at the other rears and the numbers, like the big picture of the deck does have some problems. They got a CC order, but it really only works until Persona Ride, and the numbers aren't actually that great going first, because you do kind of want to keep the boosters because you aren't restanding them going first, but that might just be a difference in playstyle. Once people actually test out the deck, it's kind of hard to say. But 2 front row restands going first is really strong. That's not tied to your opponent's Vanguard. And you do have rears that hit like basically 18, not over defensive on their own. They will need a booster. But once you get that power trigger increase, and once you have the going second turn of being able to buff up your front row by +5k or +10k, whatever it is really, really strong. So I do see a lot of people, at least specific people who were retweeting about it, that thought this was really, really strong. My first impressions just from the deck is that it doesn't feel too overwhelming as a DZ deck, but as a cohesive first wave support, it's pretty playable, I would say. Not too sure if it's exactly competitive, but still quite strong. And it's really nice that you don't really need any generics besides Strega and maybe some normal orders that we'll talk about later on, because there are a lot to talk about once we get to the grade 2 later on. That does check top 5 and grab one. So yeah, I'm kind of spoiling what the other rears do, but I think overall, Blaz does look very strong for a first release. I don't think it looks that meta though, because if you do look at the numbers, once we get to the rares, they're not actually that high, like their usual 23, 28, kind of like the collab deck numbers essentially. But I mean, it's still strong enough in this era, and when you're going first, you're getting off 5 attacks, so your opponent doesn't hit defensives. They are just like taking 4 damage in a turn, like they are just completely going to get overwhelmed. So do I think Blaz is really good? Yes. Do I think it's going to be meta? Hard to say. That's kind of the answer really every time, and Lyrical hasn't really been, a meta contender for quite some time, and I think Sweet Linker doesn't exactly change that, but maybe this deck will. So it's hard to say, but do let me know what you think of the reveals, and let's get to the rear guards. Alright, psych. So before we get to the rear guards, I want to talk about the ride line. So we have Polka here with the usual if you went second to draw 1. Then for the grade 1, we have Blaz Courante. So auto when this card is wrote upon by Blaz Tarantella. If your soul has a Blaz Polka, look at the top 5 cards of your deck. Choose up to 1 Dragoroid without Sentinel or normal order from among them. Reveal it, put into your hand, and shuffle your deck. So again, no, can't grab Regulus piece normal order, so that's super, super strong. And of course, being able to grab any of your Dragoroid pieces from track top 5, and it's basically free, is really good as well. Oh, do also note that because it does specify the Blaz starter, you do need the specific named, 0, and of course the grade 2 for the wrote upon effect. Then we have Blaz Tarantella. This is one of the more interesting ones with the continuous Vanguard circle skill that if your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 Gator and all of your Dragoroid trigger units get shield +5. So you're essentially acting as if your normal trigger Dragoroid units are basically, 20k shield or 10k shield, basically as if they're effect triggers during your opponent's turn when you go second, which is really nice. You have extra defensive utility so you don't get your absolute face shoved in. Then the auto is when wrote upon by grade 3 with Blaz. In your card name, choose up to 1 Dragoroid without Sentinel normal order from drop, put it into your hand, so you get drop zone salvage, and then you also have the top 5 in the grade 1. So pretty strong ride line, again completely costless, and that continuous Vanguard circle skill is really, really unique to this ride line. Really the only defensive ride line in standard that we have is like this, is like Sienna, which kind of punishes your opponent, basically makes them pay taxes for swinging. This is a lot more unique because it'll make all of your 15k shields 20k shields, and then your draw triggers 10k shields, so basically like their effect triggers during your opponent's turn. So living your opponent's turn is a lot easier, so you don't like immediately go to 4 or 5 damage and feel like the game is completely over, and you have that comeback when it hits your turn to have big power to your front row and basically get that 5 attacks because your opponent's grade 3 greater. So I think this ride line again is really good, just like how we saw with Sweet Linker. The ride lines have been really amazing, essentially costless like DZ power creep moment. But I do think just looking at the ride line before we get to the rears, the deck is pretty cohesive, like I said, for Sweet Linker. But I think when we get to the rears, the numbers do look a little bit underwhelming, honestly, compared to like the crazy numbers that we have had for modern DZ decks. But I think it'll still be good enough to be quite a playable deck, and at least competitive enough to the point where it'll feel like if you take this to a locals or a tournament, you have a chance of topping. We have Enthusiastic Surfing Diletta. So act and drop. If you have a grade 3 greater Vanguard with Folia in its card name, you cost Counterblast, Soul Blast 1, call this card to Rearguard Circle. Then auto backrow center Rearguard Circle. At the beginning of your battle phase, you cost rest 3 backrow Dragoroid units. Choose one of your Vanguard with Folia in its card name, and it gets continuous Vanguard Circle. All your front row units get plus 5k, so of course this will buff Vanguard as well. And then if your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 greater, they get plus 10 instead of plus 5k, so kind of like a pseudo Persona ride. Very similar, actually reminds me of the Blaze Maiden effect, which is really cool. Then until end of turn, at the end of turn, you put this card into Soul. If your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 greater, you get to draw 1. So more Soul Cycle, and really when you think about it, for all the double rares and the 1 triple rare Diletta, you really don't need any CB at all. The only CB you're really using is for the revive effect in case it gets retired, or you Soul Blast it out once it shoves itself to Soul, and then you call it back out. So for example, once it's shoved to Soul, end of turn, next turn you play normal order, call Strega, Soul Blast it out, then Counterblast, Soul Blast 1, get it back onto the board. Beginning of battle phase, you got another Persona ride essentially for the rest 3 effect if your opponent's grade 3 greater. So honestly, really strong card. But yeah, this card is super, super strong, I think, in my opinion. It's definitely the highlight of the deck because you're resetting your back row. Essentially how the deck wants you to play is you have your 2 really strong front row attackers, you rest the 3 back row beginning of battle phase, give your plus 10 to your rears, swing with those are also getting additional power. Who knows, maybe they're buffed by their plus 5 on attacks, plus the, plus 5 from the Energy Blast 2 unit. And then, you're going to swing Vanguard, and those are going to restand those 2 rears on side, and then all your back row rear guards as well. So you'll have 2 columns reset, which is pretty strong. It does definitely make a point that, this deck doesn't have 3 drives, and honestly, there isn't too much draw power, and this having the draw power linked to either your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 greater is a bit strange, but I think you will have enough plus power between, having the Shenri early game that it is enough. But the thing is, the Shenri that does count if you played a normal order for the turn isn't a Dragoroid. So I think that's kind of the hard place where you do want to find a lot of deck space. And of course, your normal orders, besides, you know, whatever you want to buff up your rears, or maybe just like Sweet X Link to make a board, whatever it is, just to kind of have more early game and to have, you know, rears that keep like supplementing themselves, because a lot of them do go to soul, and the grade 3 will like not revive itself, but will draw 1, and so will this. But you know, this checks that your opponent's grade 3 greater, so a lot of really strange limited when you can draw cards. So I thought that was a little bit strange, at least in terms of card design. But overall, looking at the rears and the effects, the deck isn't bad. I'm just not honestly super impressed with the, you know, kind of power threshold of the deck. I think in terms of conceptually, in terms of DZ lyrical support and the designs they've done, I really love Sweet Linker, and I think they've done a great job here with the, you know, reveals. You know, having that unique plus 5k on your triggers, having that extra defensive utility for your 15k triggers to make them 20k is really cool. Maybe this will be one of those decks where you play 4 vanilla, you know, friends to have those be 20k, and then maybe also play like 20k effect friends to have, you know, basically 8 20k triggers in your deck to make your deck super tanky. But I do think overall, like, Diletta is a strong card. Really, all of this is like CB-less, energy, soul blastless, except for the act and drop revive ability, obviously. And it's really easy to get it back out to just, you know, soul blast it out from soul. And then, of course, in drop, it will then be able to be activated, and you can get it back out, rest, and, you know, go from there and do your 5 attacks. Alright, so the rest of the cards are actually double rares. First off, we have Bright Skill Liliouza. So auto rear guard circle once per turn. When this unit attacks, if your back row has 3 rest Dragoroids, you may have this unit get plus 5k until end of turn. If you do, at the end of that turn, retire this unit and draw 1. So again, there is that grade 1 rear that rests the back row, 3 back row rears essentially that are Dragoroids to give that plus 10k power to Vanguard if your opponent's grade 3 greater, or if not, it's plus 5. Then the second skill for Liliouza is Continuous Guardian Circle. If you have Vanguard with Razbaz in its card name, this unit gets shield plus 5. So if you do draw it, it is at least 5k shield. Again, only your trigger units are getting buffed, not your normal units, so unfortunately this doesn't get more shield on top of that. But it's really good cycle once you hit turn 3, and it does easily hit that 18k threshold, so with the booster it would hit over defensives. So you can kind of swing this unboosted once you have buffed up your front row, and when you go first and have the 3 rested back row giving the red text plus 5 to Vanguard, this will be 23 and hit over defensive. And of course, when it restands again, even if they do hit a defensive and go to 20k, this is still hitting over. And then of course, the retire end of turn, draw 1, you get to clear off your front row and draw cards. So next up is a really weird card. We have Winter Live Check-In, and this is where I want to talk about more of the orders in the deck, especially the generic ones you can play. So this card says you play it on turn 2, it's a grade 2 normal order, you energy charge 3, then if you persona road this turn, you counter charge 1. So honestly a strong card, but it doesn't draw 1 or cycle any of your cards. So you really only want to play this when you have Strega available. And again, since Strega is a Dragoroid, you can add it to hand off of Folia, which is pretty strong. But, you know, you don't really need energy charge 3 because none of the rears really use energy except for the grade 1 that uses E2 to basically buff up a rear by plus 5 until end of turn, which is strong because that rear is going to be swinging twice because you are restanding your front row. But it is really weird that, you know, the Persona Road, the counter charge 1 is locked into Persona Road, so you're really not getting it off until turn 4. And I think you might want to consider other cards such as like Super Aesthetic Shot, even though that does burn a CB, and I think CB will be pretty tight in this deck because, you know, Strega and your Vanguard skill. You could also be playing Harmonious, which is plus 5 to 3 of your rears that does use up energy. So, you know, because Van uses 3 energy every turn, you do have to be careful with how much energy you use. So like Precia, the Ace unit, those usual cards also aren't Dragoroids as well. They're mermaids, so it's a little bit hard to fit into the deck. I think some people might still play it because early cycle is really good, but the problem is you don't really want to spend energy on those because you have to save 3 energy for your Vanguard skill, so you get that extra retire on your opponent's board, and that can be really important for killing off pesky, you know, restanders such as, you know, Yugma Shot against Bafsagra, where you know they don't have no way basically to call it back from drop. So getting rid of front row intercept attackers is really strong and definitely one of the strongest things about the Vanguard skill for this deck. But I think in terms of orders, there's also a lot of interesting stuff that you could try out in the deck. Of course, as usual, high 5, but you will have to CB1 for that because your Vanguard doesn't have divine skill. Of course, you are going to be playing the new Shenri that we saw in many reveals. You know, that card, because you're playing a normal order every turn, 13k booster, Shup to Soul, draw 1 is just so good. Like, that card is going to be amazing in this deck because you are revolving around playing normal orders every turn. And you also have like Call and Repose and other interesting normal orders that you could try out in this deck. But I think the ones that do buff up your rears at least will be stronger. Or maybe this if you do want that energy flexibility. And, you know, that counter charge will come up. It just takes a while to come out because you do have to wait until turn 4 if you went first. and you know, you're kind of catching up to your opponent and then have to play this on your turn for going second, which is a little bit harder. But honestly, it's still a pretty strong card. You know, being able to energy charge early and counter charge one, you could, I guess, E7 draw one early if you play Salentino. I guess if you did want to do that, someone did point that out, so shout out to them. But really funny card. Really weird that it doesn't cycle draw one, but essentially the point is that you are playing that turn 2 order in order to, you know, use Strega, make a board, and at worst you could always move Strega back and rest it for the grade 1 to give your power to the front row because Strega is a Dragoroid. Alright, so next up is Afterdark Outcome Sforei. So auto when placed on Vanguard circle from hand, so, you know, won't work when called off Strega. If you have a Vanguard with Blaz in its card name, you look at the top 5 cards of your deck, choose up to one normal order from among them, reveal it, put into your hand, and shuffle your deck. If you revealed, you choose a card from hand and put into your soul. So instead of pitching one, you get extra soul as the cost for adding the normal order to your hand, which is very nice. Then auto Vanguard circle once per turn when it attacks. If you have a grade 3 greater Vanguard with Blaz in its card name, it gets +5 until end of turn. So this, when you count the +5 from the grade 1, will hit over a defensive at 20. So I think it's strong enough to the point where you're still eating a lot of cards out of your opponent's hand. And, you know, the +5 being once per turn does kind of suck because, you know, on your Persona turns, it's still going to be like 25 pokes, so the numbers don't feel like super overwhelming. But I think it's still strong enough because at that point, you're still doing 5 attacks, so you're eating a lot of cards out of your opponent's hand. But, you know, you still, you know, aren't really getting crit pressure on Van or 3 drives on like Sweet Linker, even though that is more, you know, RNG. But still, you know, it's still a solid deck than 1 essentially for no cost for the on place, which I think is pretty strong. But again, you know, basically this deck only got 2 double rares, which I guess because the set is so tight and they had to, you know, really support a lot of other lyrical ride lines. This card still standalone on its own is still pretty strong. You know, shut top 5 at any normal order for no cost essentially. And again, this card also does not have the text like the other ones, or it's similar to the other ones in the sense that you can still grab a Rigless Beast off this, but again, it has to be a normal order. So you know, can't grab the Rigless Beast blitzes, but still quite strong regardless. And you know, it is your best attacker besides the grade 3. So next up is first challenge Sfiney, and then act on Vanguard circle once per turn. You cost Energy Blast 2, choose one of your Dragoroid units, and it gets +5 until end of turn. Again, since it specifies units and not rearguards, you can give this to Vanguard, but most of the time you are giving it to a rear because that rear will restand for your on attack CB1, restand your front row. So this is really the only rear because none of the double rears actually use energy or counterblast or soul, which is kind of crazy. So you have a lot of resources to work with actually, but this is the only thing that's energy blasting. So that's why I thought the energy charge order is really weird, because I don't know why else you would need like extra energy besides, you know, lyrical generics that do energy blast 3, such as, you know, the Ace unit, Safino, Prussia, the usual like generic, you know, lyrical cards that do use energy that you will throw into a deck. So maybe this card will be like a 2-of maybe in the deck because, you know, +5 to a rear that's restanding for the turn is pretty strong. But usually you don't really want to see this until late game, so, you know, it is another grade 1 you can rush with, and it is Dragoroid named, but I think the deck space will be pretty tight once you put in orders and, you know, 4 of the really good Dragoroids in the deck. So the same could be said for this card, but this is like a free body on board. So we have minimum tree Adobaera. So auto when this card is discarded from hand during your ride phase, so unfortunately it won't work during the main phase. If you have a Vanguard with Blaz and its card name, you call this card to Vanguard circle as rest. If your Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, when you would call, you may call it as stand instead of rest. So kind of similar to the TD like 6k grade 1s we got in some specific nations. When pitched, you can call as stand. This will call as rest, but if, you know, turn 3, you'll call it as stand. And then, of course, you'll be able to rest it for the cost of the grade 1. So maybe this card will be a 2-3-of. It's just really weird that it doesn't really work past your grade 3 turn, essentially. Like, it works for the ride up to grade 3, but after that, you know, turn 4 onwards, it's pretty much just there to be rest fodder as a Dragoroid. So, though it is really neat to point, though, that for the grade 1 that calls as rest, you can't pitch that turn 1 and call it as rest, which is basically something a lot of the TDs did originally, where they pitched the grade 1, called it as rest on their first turn, and the next turn you have it as stand, because, you know, beginning of turn, you stand and draw, and then you have another grade 1 to rush with. So I think that's worth pointing out. Kind of hard to say how many of this you'd want to play, probably 2, maybe 0. Kind of hard to say, I haven't actually cooked up a list yet, but the double rares are definitely cards you are going to want to be playing 4 of. So before I end the video, I want to talk about some really other funny Dragoroid generics that we do have. From Lyrical DZ Set 1, we have Bring Forth the Dreams, Tarantella. So when placed on Vanguard circle, you counterblast 1, check the top 5 cards of your deck, choose up to 1 order without Regulus piece from among them, reel it, put into your hand, and shuffle the deck. Unfortunately, it's just a grade 1 and doesn't have like a secondary ability to get power or boost. So the grade 2 really is just a better version of this, and it can grab a Regulus piece unlike this card. It's just the grade 2 that does nothing for whiffing, but like honestly you didn't pay a cost initially, so the grade 2 is really just better. But this is another option if you want more ways to find your order and another grade 1 Dragoroid to rush with besides the ones that we got revealed. We have hip hop streamer Sforei, which is a Dragoroid, and this card's really funny. When placed on Guardian Circle from hand, you can counterblast 1, choose a trigger unit other than OT from drop and call to Guardian Circle. So you could call one of your, normal fronts or crits that are Dragoroid, and they'll be 20k shield, totaling 25. Funny idea, CB1 is probably way too expensive, just wanted to point out that this is also a Dragoroid. You also have Felina from DZ Set 1 that is a Dragoroid. This has the skill that when boosting a rearguard, if you Persona Row this turn, you counterblast Soul Blast 1, choose one of your Vanguards, and it gets the continuous red tech skill that all of your rears get +5 until end of turn, and then at the end of the battle, you put this on the bottom of the deck. So it is really awkward because, in order to boost for this, you don't have to rest the 3 back row for Felina, or Selena, I'm probably getting the name wrong at this point, the grid 1 that busts up your front row. But, it is pretty hilarious that you can get another red text of all your rears get +5, but at the same time, you could just play Super Static Shot, and that's basically the same result. And then, of course, we already talked about Strega, but Strega is honestly probably the carry of this deck because it's free early game. It is a Dragoroid, placed on rear other than by unit card's ability. He played normal order this turn, Soul Blast 1, checked off 5, drew up to 1 card with grade less than or equal to your Vanguard, reveal it, and call it to rearguard circle as a unit card. If it's a normal order, you get to put it to hand. Again, Strega can also grab Wrigless pieces, very strong. And then when attacking a grade 3 greater unit, if this unit was placed this turn, so Strega's kind of useless afterwards, you get to counterblast, draw 1, and it gets +10k on a turn. So since you're not playing Shenri or something else that, does revive, such as, like Fennel's Order, you don't really have a way to reuse Strega on the turn after. So Strega on the turns after is pretty useless. I guess it could just be rest fodder for your grade 1 essentially, but that feels pretty bad when you could be committing boosters for those turns where you did go second when your opponent's grade 3 greater, because you will restand your back row Dragoroids. And then for the ones on side, you don't really care if your grade 3s, grade 2s are already hitting over their 23, 20, whatever, doing those extra swings because you are restanding your front row. So Strega is really just there for the utility for early game, and because it's Dragoroid named. So yeah, that pretty much does it. I think I talked way more than I wanted to, but I wanted to cover basically everything that I could remember and could think of, because I think this is definitely one of the most hype I've been for reveals, at least for Lyrical. Like, I was pretty upfront about Sweetlinker, that I wasn't too big of a fan, but I was really still hyped by the reveals and the card design that they did do for Sweetlinker, and I thought a lot of people were really excited about that as well. So I just wanted to kind of yap about this and really go over as much as I could in terms of Lyrical design that they are kind of moving towards to kind of push the decks a little bit more. I still do think that the Lyrical Shenri might be 2 to 3 up. It's hard to say in this list. The problem is it's not a Dragoroid, so on your later turns it's really awkward. But in that early game, anyone who's played the usual Caterpillar or Dragon Empire slop of play order, call Strega, Latifa, whatever that set 12 set 11 DZ not DZ. Well, whatever the clones were for checking top 5 call, call Shenri, whatever, rush down your opponent, make a board is really strong. It just pushes damage really easily early game, and that is really hard because once you get into the end game with this deck, when your opponent's at high damage and you're doing 5 attacks, it'll just eat up so much shield and cards out of their hand that they really might not have enough to really crack back. So I think going first, this deck will be really strong. Going second, it's kind of hard to say, but it's really cool that we do have a rideline that gives more defensive utility in the form of that grade 2 that's buffing your Dragoroid triggers into 20k shield. So yep, that pretty much does it for me. Covered everything I wanted to talk about. Do let me know if you enjoyed this video. Again, as usual, like, subscribe, the usual, whatever. And do let me know what you think of these cards. I'm really curious because I do think this has been a peak card design from the Vanguard team that we haven't really seen for a while besides the collabs. I think the collabs recently, especially for Freerun and Buddy Fight, have been really cool in terms of Cardfight Vanguard's standard DZ design, especially when, Buddy Fight had trigger units, the gauge mechanic, Soul Guard, so a lot of really interesting utilities to get around like the meta. And then Freerun is kind of more of like a brute force deck and really just utilizing like Caterpillar, but still brought some really interesting Vanguard mechanics that we didn't really have in standard, essentially from Premium and other old Vanguards back to the game. So I think that's really cool, and I think it's great to see kind of more unique card design from the standard team that I am just like usually not used to seeing, because really if we look at recent sets, they've been kind of boring. Especially set 10. I think set 10 there's not really much to talk about. I might still do like a market watch or maybe what to pick up, like cards to update for the deck in set 10, but really there isn't that much to talk about. It's just not a claim to jewel, but that's a me issue for later. Maybe you'll see some other content. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching again, and I'll see you later in another video.